Welcome. Welcome to the American Academy of Actuaries webinar, Social Security Trustees Report, a deep dive discussion with the program's actuaries. Thanks for joining us today. I look forward to the presentation and particularly the questions and answers after the presentations are complete. My name is Sam Gutterman. I'm the chairman of the Social Security Committee of the American Academy of Actuaries, and I will serve as the moderator for today's session. This webinar and the report it's based on provides all of us an annual chance to revisit and reflect on the assumptions and the financial condition of the Social Security system. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few tools that can maximize your viewing and engagement experience. The individual windows are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You may expand the slide area and the media player by clicking on the arrows on the top right corner of these windows. If you have questions for our presenters at any time, please enter them in the Ask a Question box, and we will do our best in responding to the questions that are raised. The slides from today's webinar are available in the Slides and Resources section. For answers to some common technical issues, please click the Help button at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to share your feedback on today's webinar by clicking the Take Survey tool on your screen. Webinars like today's are part of the Academy's service mission to the public and the United States actuarial profession. The Academy informs the public of the role and value of actuarial work, delivers value to members, assists policymakers in the formation of sound policy decisions and policy, and sets professional standards for U.S. actuaries. This webinar is sponsored by the Academy's Retirement Practice Council and its Social Security Committee. Please note the presenters. I won't read this information, but it is important. The presenter statements and opinions are their own and do not necessarily represent the official statements or opinions of the ABCD, ASB, any boards or committees of the American Academy of Actuaries, or any other organizations, nor do they express the opinions of the Social Security Administration. The presenters today are two well-known actuaries who are employed by the Social Security Administration, Steve Goss and Karen Glenn. Both have have a significant experience in the social insurance arena, and having served in the Social Security Administration's Office of the Chief Actuary. And I'm looking forward to listening to them. And now I will turn it over to Steve and Karen.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the introduction, and I hope we're all audible and visible here. Great opportunity to be with you all. Thank you for tuning in. We are going to be talking about the key changes under the intermediate assumptions primarily for the new 2024 Trustees Report, which came out earlier this month. And flipping to the next slide, which, there we go, okay. We just want to share with you first, and Sam alluded to this, why do we have this annual Trustees Report? The annual Trustees Report is cut out every single year starting with 1941, a little ways back before any of us were engaged on this. And the purpose for it, the legislative mandate, is to indicate what the trust fund operations have been over the past year and expected for the next 5 years. Typically thought of as the near term has been expanded some years ago to looking at the next 10 years, similar to the budget window for federal operations as a whole. But the number 2 item here is the actuarial status of the trust funds. And what does this really mean? What is the expectation over at least the next 75 years for the actuarial financial status of the trust funds? And this is really to provide an indication to the Congress as to whether or not what is scheduled in law for the revenues will be sufficient to to cover what's scheduled in the law for the scheduled benefit levels in the future. And if in fact the scheduled revenue is not sufficient to cover the scheduled level of benefits, this indicates to Congress to what degree and when some changes will need to be made in order to meet the level of scheduled benefits, or to modify the level of scheduled benefits lower to match up with the revenues. This is really critical for the function of the system and maintaining its actuarial status. So on the next slide, Karen and I are going to run through some of the changes here. We're going to go back and forth a little bit to keep it interesting, hopefully. So changes for the 24 Trustees Report. And just to indicate, spoiler alert, nothing fundamental has really changed in the prospectus of Social Security for the actuarial status, but there are a number of, we think, very interesting modifications that have made for this year. The three primary changes for this year, one is in the economic area. In calendar year 2023, the economy really operated at much greater strength than had been anticipated by most econometric forecasters, and it functioned much better. GDP grew much better, employment grew much better than had been anticipated by the trustees. Trustees were not alone. Econometric forecasters were viewing a slowdown in 23, as was the president's budget, and even more so was CBO. So we were all pleasantly surprised that the economy, labor productivity, and employment did well in 2023. And on the basis of this, the trustees have modified their prospectus for the longer-term future to assume that the level of labor productivity and GDP will be higher than assumed in last year's report, and in fact are basically matching the levels that we had in 2022 Trustees Report. Now on disability, the second item that was a significant change, as all are well aware, the trustees have been noticing, also have been saying that disability incidence has been falling considerably short for over a decade from what had been anticipated. On this basis, the trustees have now lowered our ultimate incidence rate from 4.8 per thousand exposed and down to 4.5 per thousand. Applications and awards have both continued to be low. The third item that we'll be discussing a little bit here is the demographic area. Primarily the item there of interest is in the birth rate or the fertility rate. The total fertility rate in very recent years has been much lower than expectations. It's reached an all-time low, and the trustees have, as usual, decided to make an incremental change, dropping from attaining a 2.0 ultimate total fertility rate as of 2056 in last year's report down to a 1.9 level for the total fertility rate by 2040 of this year. Time will tell where we go with that exactly. And the bottom line of these three changes really change our so-called actuarial deficit, now at 3.5% of taxable payroll over the next 75 years, down from the 3.61% that was projected in last year's report. Now, let me just mention a few extra words about the first of those three. Karen's going to then cover the second and third ones of those. So the primary one in the economic area, speaking of real GDP, we look at the level of GDP in real terms. This is in billions of dollars priced to 2017, the standard approach. And what you can see here is the dark blue or black line on the bottom is where we were in projecting the GDP level out into the future in the last year's 2023 Trustees Report. You can see there's a considerable drop-off reflecting some not good expectations for the calendar year 2023. You can see a pretty flat line on real GDP, and then staying at a lower level than we had been in prior reports. For this year's report, we have seen actually on the red line that GDP did much better than had been anticipated by econometric forecasters and the Trustees Report, the budget, and CBO, and we're up at a much higher level through 2023. And projecting to have a bit of a slowdown here over the next 2 or 3 years, then coming back to a level that is about 3% higher than we had been last year, which, by the way, puts us at about the same level we were in the 2022 and the 2020 Trustees Reports. So next slide, Karen, I think is taking it away.
Great, thanks, Steve. And good afternoon and good morning to those of you out there. We're always excited to do this presentation and share a little bit of our knowledge with you. So on these next few slides, we're talking about disability benefits. And it's important to remember that Social Security is not just a retirement program. It also covers survivors benefits, disability benefits. So something interesting that's been going on over the last several years is changes in the patterns of applications for and approvals for disability benefits. So on this slide, we are showing all the way back to 2003, just the number of applications for disability benefits that have been coming into Social Security. You can see that back in 2003 through about 2008, we were at a level of 1.5 million a year. Then the Great Recession hit. That brought us all the way up to about 1.9 million in those years. Ever since then, it's been declining pretty dramatically. And what you can see on this graph is that in every year's trustees report, starting with the 2012, all of those colorful lines coming down show that we keep projecting the application levels to come back up. So far, they haven't really done that, except in this most recent year. We have seen a little bit of a tick up there. But you can see that those levels are very low, well below historical levels. We in the trustees are still projecting that applications will come up to roughly that 1.5 million level, kind of in line with historical experience. Something very similar on this next slide. This is the disability incidence rate. This actually reflects the awards for disability benefits. So people who not only apply, but then get awarded for benefits. A very similar picture. Ever since the Great Recession, those incidence rates have been coming down, except for a little bit in this most recent year. One thing that Steve already mentioned is that the trustees did, in this year's trustee report, decide to change the ultimate assumption for that disability incidence rate. So we lowered it from 4.8 per thousand to 4.5 per thousand. Sort of an incremental move, recognizing the experience we've seen over the last several years. There are a bunch of reasons for these changes. The decline, we believe, is significantly due to just the changing nature of work. People are more able to hold a job these days because more accommodations by employers, increased incidence of telework, and just less physical labor in the jobs that are out there. So we believe that's been driving much of the decline. The little bump up you see this year, some of that is just related to SSA staffing levels. So, and the increase we're expecting over the next few years, we are really hoping to bring down those pending levels of disability claims by increasing staffing. You may see that little note at the bottom on the left. Our office has recently put out an actuarial note exploring the effects of the limited staffing. And Steve Goss and Mike Stevens are the authors on that. So please go to our website and check that out if you're interested. So putting these factors together, what does this mean in terms of the overall number of disabled worker beneficiaries? The black line we see on this graph here was what we were expecting in 2008. This was before we recognized any effects of the Great Recession. So we were expecting the level of beneficiaries to continue going up and stabilize at a level of about 10 million. Instead, you can see the red and the blue lines are what we were projecting in the 2024 and 2023 trustees report. Those reflect the increase over expected levels due to the Great Recession, and then the big decline after that. The lower red level this year does reflect that lower assumed incidence rate in the long term. So instead of being at a level of about 10 million, we're more like 7.5 million overall beneficiaries by 2033. All right, another assumption Steve mentioned is the total fertility rate. And this is one that's been getting a lot of attention recently. Up until this trustees report, we had been assuming that fertility rates would rise back up to the level of 2.0 children per woman over her lifetime. This year, the trustees decided, again, to make an incremental change. That's the general approach the trustees take, is to make these changes incrementally. So we made an incremental change from that 2.0 to a 1.9 level. You can see that that 1.9 is a good bit above where we are right now. As Steve said, still to be seen exactly what will happen in the future. Are these recent low birth rates a sign of things to come, or are they mainly the effect of women having children later in life? We're not quite sure, but again, the trustees did decide to make that incremental change. A bunch of interesting patterns on this slide. You can see that this goes all the way back to 1865, right around the time of the Civil War. Obviously a very different society at that point, but birth rates were up at about 5 per woman way back then. You can see the effect of the baby boom in the 50s and 60s, and the relatively level rates since then, dropping below 2, then slightly above 2, and since then below. So again, where will we end up? Not quite sure, but our assumption right now is 1.9 in the long term. We aren't really going to talk about it much today, but we also think a lot about immigration. Obviously, the two ways of bringing new workers into the system are births and immigration. So those two, there's an interesting interplay there as far as the system goes overall. And finally, a very similar picture here. You can see the historical birth rates. This is more on a cohort basis. So rather than looking at each year at a time, this shows birth rates by the year of birth of the mother. And the purple here is fully historical data. These are women who have completed their childbearing years. The blue in the middle is partially historical. It's more historical the further to the left you go. And over to the right, it's partially projected. So obviously more projections the further to the right you go. At the very right in the green is our long-term assumptions. The alternative 2 is our intermediate assumption of that 1.9. You can see that on a cohort basis, that rate is just slightly below where we are now. So, it seems very reasonable to us. We also, in the trustees report, look at more optimistic and pessimistic scenarios, so that you can see in the alternative 1 and alternative 3, where we've got a 2.1 and a 1.6 respectively. And that's to give a reasonable range of what we expect in the future. And I think with that, Steve, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Karen. And if I may just step back for just a moment on the fertility, just to add one other little note, because I've been around for a while. On this particular slide, please note that we did have a period after that big baby boom bulge where we dropped down below 2.0 for the total fertility rate back between about 1976 and 1990. In that period, there was concern, as there is now, that the birth rate would stay low, and the trustees at a point dropped down to 1.95 and to 1.9 for an ultimate total fertility rate. Lo and behold, by 1990 through about 2008, the total fertility rate came back up, very much for the reasons that Karen mentioned, that women in that period were starting to have children at higher ages. So at that point, then the trustees came back to an assumption of 2.0, consistent also with surveys, even to this most recent date, of women's expectation for number of children. But where we are going in the future is indeed a gigantic question and a very fundamental one. So with that, thank you, Karen, for covering all of that. Now, for the basic results for the 2024 trustees reports, going back to sort of the full macro level, one of the things we very, very oftentimes look at very fundamentally and talk with members of Congress and others who are going to have to make the decisions about what changes will be made to the program in the future, is the level of the trust fund financing. Of course, this is important because this is not an advanced funded program, something all actuaries and everybody on this webinar are very familiar with, but it really is basically a pay-as-you-go finance system. So what's critical is to know what our trust fund reserves, the amount of money held in federal securities and treasuries in the trust funds, how that looks relative to what we usually scale it to is the annual cost of the program. And you can see historically and into the projection what we're projecting this to be. Now, the really good news is the Disability Insurance Trust Fund, which is a separate legal entity from the Old Age and Survivors Insurance. You can see in last year's Trustees Report, the dashed blue line, that we were looking in good shape through 75 years. And this year we're looking in extraordinarily good shape with the expectation of only, as Karen indicated, this incremental reduction in the disability incidence rate. So it may turn out that, in fact, the DI program is, in fact, slightly overfinanced relative to the usual desire to maintain at least a 100% trust fund ratio as a contingency reserve just in case something does not follow as hoped and expected. You can also see, interestingly, historically, the last two times we reached a point where we were approximating reserve depletion, at which point we would not have been able to continue paying the full scheduled benefits. We would not run out of money. But reserve depletion was for the DI program, the blue line. Back in 1995 and 2015, modifications were made to the allocation of the overall tax rate to put DI in better shape, succeeded very well. And on top of it, of course, as Karen so well pointed out, our incidence rates have been just staying very, very low, much lower than had been expected by virtually all in recent years. The OESI program, which is the red line, not quite the same story. The OESI program in the 2024 Trustees Report, the solid line, is very similar to that for the dashed line. You can't see a lot of difference. It's extended a little bit more to the right. The OESI program is in a little bit better shape. We are projecting for the overall OESDI program, the black line, to be in slightly better shape this year. We were projecting the reserve depletion date last year to be in 2034, and this year it's extended out to 2035, actually 13 months later. So that's a real improvement based on the changes that we've talked about. By the way, the economic and the disability changes have near-term implications, and that's really why the OESDI moved out. And of course, both of those contribute towards the disability, and that's why the blue line for disability is so much better than last year. OESI reserve depletion is also extended somewhat, still within the calendar year 2033, but it's moved from April to November of that year. So it's 7 months extended for the expectation of reserve depletion, but that is the one coming up soon that we are going to need to address. So on the next slide, a little bit different picture. Here's something also I hope everybody's very familiar with, looking at the cost and the annual revenue income to the programs, non-interest income, looking at what those cash flows are for those two sides. The blue line is the cost of paying scheduled benefits, the solid line up to 2035, and the darker blue lines, that's for this year's Trustees Report. And you can see that the cost is rising quite a bit from about 2008 to 2035, up to a higher level and then moving around a little bit, but staying basically at the higher level that we reach by about 2035 to 2040. You can see the difference for the fainter blue lines, which is last year's Trustees Report, which rose early on to a somewhat higher level this is cost as percentage of our tax base or our taxable payroll. And you can see the cost is showing at a lower level this year through the early years. Why? Again, because the economy is better and because disability is better. So that made a fundamental change in this relationship. And that's why we have an extended year of reserve depletion for the combined OESDI trust funds. We are in a position where we're looking this year at the point of reserve depletion. If Congress were to allow that to happen, which we're confident they will not, in 2035 for the combined program, it would be at 83% of scheduled benefits would still be payable at that point. And last year, at the point of reserve depletion, it was projected only 80%. So it's slightly better in that relatively near term. For the projection as we go out further, you can see that the dark blue line here, the cost rate, is a little bit higher than last year ultimately. And that's really because by that time, the change to the fertility rate dominates the other two factors that are changed this year, the economic and the disability. So with a little bit higher cost rate relative to the income rate, you can see now we're in a position where we're projecting we would be able to have payable benefits at 73% of those scheduled in 2098, whereas last year the projection was 74% in 2097. So we definitely have work to do. The Congress has work to do in moving us along in this area. So this is just a little picture of sort of just the differences in those two cost rates, the actuarial balances. And this puts a little finer point on what has changed from last year. The red line shows our annual balances, which are deficits, of course. We have less money coming in and non-interest income than we have scheduled to be paid out. And you can see that the deficit level is a smaller negative this year through about 2077, but then it's a slightly larger negative later. And again, it's the play across these three changes: the economic improvement throughout the 75-year period and the disability improvement throughout the 75-year period tends to make the deficit overall smaller, but that gets overcome by the change in fertility rate, again indicating the strength and importance of fertility rates as we move into the future, and for this program just in general. So one more item on that is that we like to point out too, there's not just the cost rate and whether or not we will reach reserve depletion at a point and need addressing of Congress. Here's the question about the sustainability of the program. We would say a program looks going to be unsustainable if its cost as percent of, in this case, gross domestic product. We're rising and we're continuing to rise at a steady pace and not sort of leveling off in the vicinity of 6%. The program would appear to be sustainable in the future, rising up to from about the 4.5% of GDP where it's been historically, prior to the major change in the age distribution of the population. But in going up to 6%, that is a challenge, but it does not appear to be an unsustainable trend. It's going to be a higher level of cost relative to GDP and payroll, so adjustments will need to be made. And on that, I think now passing the baton again to Karen.
Great. So kind of summarizing everything we've said so far and focusing on the trust fund reserve depletion year, this is the number that gets the headlines, right? You'll see in the news, OASDI reserve depletion is 2035. As Steve mentioned, that's 13 months later than last year's report. The factors we talked about are the big reasons for the change. The economic and disability changes are a good thing for the trust funds throughout the 75-year projection. The change in the fertility rate partially offsets those good factors and leads to a slight negative at the end of the 75-year projection period. Another thing that gets a lot of focus is OASI reserve depletion on its own. So this is the Retirement and Survivors Fund. That we expect will become depleted in 2033, same calendar year as we projected last year, but 7 months later. And this is basically due to those good economic factors. DI reserves do not become depleted over the 75-year long-range projection period. Again, same as we projected last year, but actually a little better overall. And this is due to the incidence awards factors we discussed already. And just to put this in picture form, so this graph is showing the year of report on the dotted line on the bottom, and the blue line is where we expected the combined trust fund reserve depletion year to be. You can see that ever since the 1991 report, we've projected that reserve depletion will fall between 2029 and 2042. In the last 13 reports since 2012, it's been very, very stable. So between 2033 and 2035. But what you do want to note is that the gap between the year of report and the year of depletion is shrinking. So we are getting ever closer to that point of trust fund reserve depletion. And very quickly, because we have mainly an audience of actuaries, I thought I'd throw in a bunch of numbers. For those of you who are pension actuaries, this is basically our version of the gain loss analysis. We go through each one of the factors and see which ones contributed to the change in actuarial balance. I'm not going to go over this in any detail, but a couple of things to note. the change in the valuation period, which is this one at the very top. Every year we see a small effect of the change in the valuation period as we move forward. We are discounting the liabilities to a later date, and we are building in a big year of deficit at the end of the 75-year period, because we always have a 75-year period. Adding in that one bad year at the end worsens the actuarial balance. No effects of legislation this year. Demographic changes worsened the actuarial balance, and that's mainly due to that change in the fertility rate. Economic data and assumptions overall were a good thing for this year's actuarial balance, as explained already. Disability overall was a good thing, mainly because we changed that assumption for the ultimate incidence rate. And every year we try to make changes in methods just to improve our projections and build in the latest programmatic data. Those changes had a relatively small good effect on the actuarial balance this year. So putting it all together, that brought us from the 3.50 last year to 3.61 last year to 3.50 actuarial deficit this year. And Steve, I think you're going to take it from here.
Thank you, Karen. So the question is, why did we get it wrong in 1983? Well, first of all, the thing not to look at, and everybody here will understand that, is the actuarial balance or the actual deficit itself, because the actual deficit in 83 and in 2023, a full 40 years later, is looking at a very different 75-year period. We've got 40 years after what was considered in 1983 in the 75-year period, all of which are high deficit years, because that's after the point of all the major changes that have elevated cost relative to the payroll or the GDP. So really do not pay too much attention. In fact, we have a wonderful little extra note, I think, indicating the changes since the 1983 report, and you'll see on the actuarial balance or actual deficit, that's largely just from changing the valuation period. Now, what is important, as Karen had already indicated, is focus on the year of reserve depletion. That's not the only thing to pay attention to, obviously. It's the share of scheduled benefit that is still payable at that point. But the year of reserve depletion is something that appropriately gets a lot of attention. And the thing is, we should avoid talking about insolvency, running out of money, can't pay any benefits, because none of that is true. So let's all, amongst us, be very, very clear on this. Now, back in the 1983 amendments, it was projected that the reserves would become depleted out around 2063, and now we're projecting 2035. That's almost 30 years earlier. So why is that? Well, there have been some suggestions you've probably heard in various places over the last few weeks about, it's because we're living too long, increased longevity. As it turns out, if you look back in the 1982 and 83 trustees reports, our projected life expectancy at age 65, male and female combined, it's virtually identical to what has actually happened, at least through 2015, prior to the pandemic. So longevity is not the issue. Longevity was foreseen to be improving to the extent that we have actually seen happen. Now, on the next slide, the thing that is really the fundamental change that are really facing is why that cost as percent of GDP and why that cost as percentage of our taxable fuel is rising so very much. Everybody here is very familiar with this item called the age of dependency ratio, the ratio of the population over 65 to the population between 20 and 64. Rough proxies for the beneficiary, at least the retirement age population, versus the working age population. And you can see how dramatically this age of dependency ratio has risen between 2008 and about 2035 or 40. Why? Largely because of the birth rates. If you look at the blue and red lines, a graph we hope everybody here has seen many times before, that we would have this age of dependency ratio rising very much less, principally just from what happens because of longevity itself, which is a factor. But the change in birth rate is really the fundamental change that has changed it. However, this was also known and projected and expected back at the time of 1983. So what's happened since 1983 that has affected our almost 30 years earlier reserve depletion? Well, a major factor on that, and we pointed this out in some Senate Budget Committee testimony back in July of last year, a couple of factors going to the economy. The primary one is the changing proportion of all covered earnings under Social Security that are falling below our taxable maximum. And this declined back since 1983 because of the way we structured increasing our taxable maximum level to rise with the average wage. Everything would have been fine if the distribution of earners around the average wage had remained the same, but it has not. Between the period of 1983 to the year 2000, you can see sort of a low point met in 2000 on this taxable ratio, the share of all the covered earnings that fall under our taxable maximum. It dropped from 90% down to about 82.5%. Why? Well, because the highest 6% of earners, those who have some earnings above our taxable maximum, had a much greater increase in their average earnings and therefore share of the total earnings. So we had a substantial increase in the share of earnings falling above our taxable maximum. The highest 6% of earners, lucky them, had a 62% real increase over the 17 years from 1983 to 2000. That is increasing their average earnings over and above in CPI inflation, whereas the bottom 94% on average had only a 17% increase. So it's that relative shift, or we sometimes call it dispersion in earnings, that has really contributed towards a drop-off in the revenue coming to the program through 2000. And we have stayed at that lower level and expecting to stay at that lower level in the future. This is the unanticipated factor, along with the negative impact that we had in the Great Recession that Karen pointed out and talked to about a little bit later. So sort of a corollary, another aspect of this is to show the share of workers who are above our taxable maximum. And you can see this has stayed very stable at about 6%. However, the share of all of the covered earnings that are attributable to their excess earnings above the taxable maximum has risen, dramatically over time. So you can see that this is really the factor, and of course, this is why we've seen rise to lots of possible changes to change the taxable maximum in one way, shape, or form or another. And we expect there's a probability of some legislation in the future moving in that direction. So with that, I think we're moving back to Karen.
So we did also want to show some other assumptions that we focus on that are of interest to actuaries in general. The first one of those is mortality, obviously a critical assumption in any actuarial calculation, just about. This graph, first of all, is showing mortality experience for ages under 65. Obviously, what really jumps out here is the COVID pandemic. The high death rates in 2020 for folks under age 65, they were even higher in 2021. You can see that big spike there. Came down a good bit in 2022 to a level a little bit below 2020, and we're projecting to come down after that. Another thing to note on this graph is the relatively flat mortality experience since about 2010 for this group. This is often attributed to the so-called deaths of despair, just the really poor mortality experience, mainly among men, but also women. And we're going to get into a little more detail on that on the next slide. But the thing to note here is that clearly in those reports prior to the pandemic, we are expecting continued mortality improvement indicated by the continued declining level. There's a huge disruption, and we are expecting to get back to those same trends by about 2025. So as mentioned, zooming in a little bit more on those deaths of despair. This is a really interesting graph that we put together based on some CDC death data. So the one that really jumps out is the pink line that jumps up from 2014, keeps increasing dramatically all the way through 2022. That's other synthetic narcotic poisoning, mainly fentanyl. So, that's just been huge for this age group. And again, this is focusing on those folks under age 65. Other things that fall into this category, other opioids, alcohol poisoning, heroin, suicide. None of these are good news stories. The one thing that is declining a bit is heroin, which is sort of the greenish, yellowish line kind of in the middle towards the bottom. Basically, the only reason that's declining is because of being supplanted by fentanyl. So not a great news story. Will these patterns continue? Again, really difficult to say. We're hopeful that things will turn around, but something we're keeping an eye on for the future. Now, turning to those ages 65 and older, kind of a similar pattern. You can see that for those folks, 2020 was the worst year of the COVID pandemic. There were stories about folks in nursing homes who were severely affected by that. And these folks tended to get vaccines earlier than the rest of the population. So things did improve in 2021, 22. You can see that we are projecting the effects to come back down to the same sorts of trend lines we were assuming before the pandemic. And we are assuming that by 2025. Putting it all together, again, a similar picture. This is all ages. Obviously, mortality experience for all ages is primarily based on those over age 65 because there are just more deaths at those ages. So, still a question for us is what will the net effect of the pandemic be on mortality and also disability in the future? We are still assuming offsetting effects for the residual population after the pandemic. So not assuming any real compromise on the future population because of the pandemic, but that is a question. Some folks have also suggested there's kind of a weeding out effect. Maybe the folks that are still remaining are the healthier ones. So in our projections, we've sort of assumed a balancing between those two and assumed no real effect of COVID going forward. All right, Steve, back to you.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thanks for the rundown on the mortality. As you can see, these projections are not what some had thought 10, 20 years ago, that pretty soon we'd abolish death. Unfortunately, not the case, even ignoring the pandemic. There's somewhat of a slowdown. And there is, by the way, just a little picture for a later slide. Karen and some others in our office have done some really excellent work at looking at differential mortality by career earnings levels, which of course is what determines benefit levels from Social Security. Very important work, and more on that coming in the future. But going back to the economics for the moment, there is the question of employment. We do have the issue about the age distribution of the population, the number of the people in the population, but the employment rates are also very, very critical. And you can see where we've been historically in the employment rates. The middle red line historically has been rising somewhat for men and women combined. The top red line has actually been coming down a little bit for men. This is on an age-sex adjusted basis to the 2020 population distribution. But women, you can see the dramatic increase in employment rates back from 1981, especially through about the early 1990s, and continuing up from that. Now, the change from last year's trustees report, first of all, you can see in the very, very near-term material, the blue line is last year's 2023 trustees report, again, consistent with that expectation of a slowdown in employment and the economy, which we did not materialize. You can see through about 2023, the numbers for men, women, and combined really came up nicely in the employment rates. For men, we've got a little bit of a bobble here with some expectation of a bit of a slowdown over the next 2 or 3 years, but then coming back up by about 2026, 27. That's something that is built into our assumptions. For women, you can see a considerable increase in the level of employment in the future, even above what we had in last year's trustees report. And there are some reasons for that. I mean, a number of things factor in. One is, of course, is the disability rates themselves. With a lower disability rate, assumed in this year's trustees report, that plays into our labor force and employment models. suggests with fewer people disabled, we'll have more people in the labor force and more people employed. So that's a positive there. Another factor is, in fact, the lowering of the total fertility rate. Child presence is something that tends to keep people, especially women, out of the labor force, at least for a period. So with the lower fertility rate, we have some factor on that. And additionally, part of the reason for a greater increase for women than men is a reflection of the fact that women have been in recent years, in fact, some time now, having much greater increases in educational attainment than men, also contributing towards employment rates. So some positive stuff on the employment rates and the expectations for the future. Now, employment over 65, another factor. With the changing age distribution already discussed, and as Karen mentioned, about the flexibility of employers in seeking to get people to get into and stay in the labor force, with a shrinking share of our adult population being at younger traditional working age, and a greater share being at higher ages. Obviously, there's going to be more accommodation by employers. We've been hearing much of this, and probably even more in the future. You can see here the employment rate for people over 65. This is not different. You can see the top lines here, the employment rates relatively stable at 25 to 54. But as you go down the line, especially to say 65 to 74, sort of, purplish line, you can see the fairly significant increase over time that we've had for both women and for men. Not quite as much at 75 and older, but that might be expected to change some in the future. So an increasing share of people at higher ages, perhaps in part because of some greater longevity and greater health and capability, but also because of the changing age distribution of the population. If we need people working, we have fewer people 20 to 54, then we're going to tap more into keeping people on the job at higher ages. And we've been seeing that significantly, and there's a reasonable expectation that that will continue into the future. On this slide, we also see the age at starting Social Security retirement benefits. This is really fascinating. The question is, people oftentimes ask the question, at what age should I start my benefits? Well, ever the peak of people starting benefits, you can see here, you can look at these on the left and right slides for men and for women. You can see the share, for instance, on the bottom line of people who have decided to start their benefits as of about 62. And you can see we reached a peak of that back before the year 2000, back around 1995, but that's been dropping dramatically. And interestingly, even in the most recent recession, which was very brief in 2020, we did not have an increase in the share of people filing for retirement benefits at early ages, or at ages in general. We did see that back at the time of the so-called Great Recession. We saw a boost in people filing for benefits, but the brevity of the 2020 recession and also emergency payments that were available really avoided that. So we've got more and more people waiting to higher and higher ages, very consistent with the higher employment rates that we've been seeing recently, and we should be expecting this into the future. So with that, I think we're about to turn the baton once again. Let's see here.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. I will take the next few slides. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the broader retirement landscape and the effects of Social Security on federal debt. So first, we've talked a lot about solvency and the assumptions that go into making those solvency projections. Instead, we want to look a little bit at benefits and how adequate those are. So this graph is showing replacement rates. So the level of the benefit after retirement versus earnings before retirement. The way we measure this for Social Security is on the career average level wage index, which ends up being very close to earnings right before retirement. Basically, it's designed that way. So this graph here is showing benefit levels for folks who retire at age 65. This was traditionally the Social Security normal retirement age for many years. As most of you know, that is now up to age 67. But this is just to give us a consistent look at one age over time. So a few things to note here. First, the very low earners. So we have a few sample earners here. Folks who make roughly $17,000 a year, those people get about 70% of their earnings back as a benefit. And this really shows the progressive nature of the program. Low earners get a high replacement rate, higher earners get a lower replacement rate. The folks at the bottom of the graph, those are your maximum earners. So those who have earned up to the Social Security taxable maximum, which was $168,600 this year. Those folks are getting more like a 25% replacement rate. So you can definitely see the gradation there, and also some of the changes throughout time. Those replacement rates are expected to be very level in the future, just based on the benefits scheduled in law. Now, these are scheduled benefits. What happens if we look at when the trust fund reserves deplete? At that point, as Steve mentioned earlier, we would only be able to pay about 83% of benefits, dropping down a bit over time. So that very low earner, who was at a level of close to 70%, drops down to more like 55, 50%. Similarly, that max earner drops down to everybody drops down here. Now, one thing to note, this assumes that everybody's benefits would be cut equally. There is no precedent for the trust fund reserves becoming depleted. There are many things that could potentially happen at that point. Our understanding is that the Social Security Commissioner at the time would decide how benefits are paid out. Would it be everybody takes the same benefit cut? Would potentially lower earners continue to get their benefits? Would the commissioner choose their favorite 83% of people and let them continue to get their benefits? Just not determined. And we hope and believe it will never actually come to that. One other thing, just again, looking at the broader retirement landscape, as I'm sure many of you know, defined benefits, which were historically the way many folks received their retirement benefits, have been largely supplanted by defined contributions. And there's a really notable X in this graph showing that switchover. That's really leveled off over the last 20 years or so, maybe even a little bit more. But you know, the people who are getting either benefit has been pretty stable at actually what in my opinion is the really low level of 50%. So others are not getting any benefits or DBs or DCs from their employers. Those are the folks who do rely primarily on Social Security. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the federal debt, things you may have heard in the press.
Karen, okay, so this is back to me here.
It is back to you, Steve.
Okay, very good. Well, so first of all, as Karen indicated, we do have this prospect of trust fund reserve depletion, which has not happened in the past. And the first question on that is really what happens? And as Karen and we both have indicated, that at that point, the trust funds do not have the ability to spend money that are not available in the trust funds. There is no source other than the tax revenues which have accrued to the trust funds and have built up and gained interest over time when we have positive balances. So that is really the source. Now, as a result, the trust funds can only have positive balances. And because of where trust fund assets are invested, they're all invested in Treasury securities. The trust funds can't borrow, they can't create debt, but they can in fact hold a portion of the federal debt, which is now somewhere $33 to $34 trillion in total federal debt. The trust funds hold almost $3 trillion of it. So the trust funds actually serve the OESI and DI trust funds to actually support part of the debt that is accrued by the rest of the government actions. Again, the trust funds cannot borrow, So if we do reach the point where reserves deplete and Congress were to fail to act, we'd simply drop, as we indicated in 2035, to only being able to pay 83 cents on the dollar overall, and not pay the full amount by any other means unless we have changes in the law, an important consideration. Now, there is a budget scoring convention employed by both the Office of Management and Budget and by Congressional Budget Office, which tends to say that, in fact, if the trust fund reserves do become depleted, that let's imagine that, in fact, the benefits will all still be paid in full. And how will this happen? It'll happen by a change in law, not always stated, by a change in law saying that Social Security will henceforth get any extra money it needs from the general fund of the Treasury, which would require more borrowing from the public. Well, is that now that's not the law. However, the sort of thing that has been pointed out to us as to the reason for this convention is a 1985 act, which you can see in the blue lettering here, section 225. I won't read off that whole thing, but the key point here is that it simply says that scoring should be done on the basis of assume that entitlement authority is assumed to be adequate to make all payments required by those laws. Now, of course, required by and intended by the laws are two different things. This is why we always refer to any shortfalls in funding for Social Security benefits in the future as an unfunded obligation and not a liability. The trust funds are not allowed to spend any money that is not readily available in the trust funds. Therefore, paying full benefits after reserve depletion is not only not required by these laws, it is not even allowed. So we should be very, very clear. If anybody wants to talk about the kind of things that we show on the next slide. Here we go. On the next slide, these are projections in the black lines on the left of what the Congressional Budget Office shows for the publicly held debt in the past and in the future. And on the right-hand panel is what the President's Budget 2025 shows for the publicly held debt. And both of these are rising up to higher levels in the future. And CBO is projecting this to rise from a little bit under 100% of GDP to 166% by a little after 2050. President's budget is projecting it to rise also up to about 110 to 15%, also an increase. But here's the critical part. These assume that after the point of reserve depletion around 2035, that the black lines will continue to be at high levels. Why? Because it's assumed that there will be a change in law fully financing Social Security's trust funds by money transferred from the general fund of the Treasury. Again, that's not in the law, it's never been in the law, and is not expected to be in the law in the future. If we look, in fact, at the reality of what is actually a current law projection, we can see that on really the red line, which presumes that both for the OESI and DI trust funds and also for the Medicare HI trust fund, that in fact, after reserve depletion, that which will be paid is only that which was available. And you can see in that case then where the red line is going to much lower levels. So keep in mind that when people talk about rising debt and they talk about the implications of entitlements, that we should not be counting the elevation of the black lines out into the distant future. We should really be looking at where the red lines are going if we look at what actually is current law practice. A little addendum on the left side too, you might say publicly held debt. Well, the trust fund balances themselves, which are a part of the total federal debt, are those in effect really a part of publicly held debt also? They are debt that accrue from what? They accrue from extra revenues coming into the trust funds over the years and loaned to the Treasury. So those are numbers that will be redeemed in time, obviously, for paying benefits to the public through Social Security and Medicare. So one could actually look at those elevated lines historically and see that we're already at about 110% of GDP. And according to the President's budget, we're actually going to be lower than that in the more distant future. CBO higher, but not anything like 166%. So I just want to make this point really clear, because we hear all the time about the trust funds and entitlements having major effects on future debt and future deficits. And so this slide hopefully will be helpful to all to sort of take a peek and understand more the reality. So on the next slide, we're just going to go very quickly to how to eliminate the Social Security long-term actuarial deficit. That is the shortfall of what is scheduled in law for revenue versus what's scheduled for the benefit payments in the future. Now, the bottom line, as you've already seen, is the long-term projections provide information to assess the solvency. We sometimes say solvency, that is really just the ability to fully pay the scheduled benefits, and what changes are going to be needed to eliminate those shortfalls. Now, we've got a choice. We can we can either increase revenue or lower cost, but full benefits cannot be paid timely under current law without such changes. Again, no pressure on the federal debt, and Congress must act, and it always has in the past. We've never reached a point where Social Security has failed to pay the full scheduled benefits on a timely basis. So comprehensive changes need to be implemented by 2035. And Karen, I think you're going to run us through a few of the options.
Yeah, very quickly, we're going to go over a few things folks have proposed to solve that solvency gap. So first, a few ways to lower cost. First possibility is to lower benefits for retirees. Generally, well, not generally, one option here is to increase the normal retirement age. So what that does is it lowers OASI cost, but it does increase DI cost a bit because those folks who are on DI wouldn't switch over to the OASI program until a year later. Steve, I'm getting some feedback. Can you perhaps put yourself on mute? Thank you. All right.
Thanks.
All right, great. So along those lines, for if we do increase the normal retirement age, one option would be to exempt folks who are long career low earners. So perhaps those folks who can't afford to stop and wait for retirement. And this was done, for example, in the Simpson-Bowles proposal in 2010. They just said those folks, the retirement age would stay where it is, but for everyone else, the retirement age would be increased. Other possibilities, lower benefits, mainly for high earners. One option would be to just reduce the PIA, the benefit formula, above some level. I mean, the rationale there would be that higher earners generally live longer and could potentially afford to finance their retirement by other means than Social Security. A lot of times such an approach is combined with increasing the PIA below some level. So really adding more progressivity to the program. Often this is subject to work year requirements. So want to make sure that it's folks who have really worked, had a full career, paid into the system for a long time. Other things considered a lot are changing the COLA. And the way we've put this here is a little bit tongue-in-cheek to lower benefits, mainly for the oldest old. The proposal here would be to reduce the COLA by using the chain-weighted CPI-U. That is about 0.3% on average lower, or percentage points, lower than the COLA on average. As any good actuary knows, that compounds over time. So it really does affect those who have been receiving benefits the longest, the most. On the other side of the coin, some say we should change the COLA in the other direction. Instead of using the current CPI-W, which is what current law says, instead use the CPI-E, which is based on the market basket of purchases of consumers over age 62. That index ends up being a little bit higher than the current COLA, so about 0.2 percentage points higher every year. Again, that would compound, so as people stay in benefit status longer, they would get bigger and bigger benefits. And the idea here is that this is really more representative of the population we serve under Social Security. On the other side, there are ways to increase revenue coming into the program. And the simplest one is obviously just to raise the 12.4% payroll tax rate. We could do that across the board. If we raise that about 3.5, give or take, that would solve the 75-year shortfall. Other options include raising taxes on the highest earners. So increasing that taxable maximum amount from its current 168,600, as Steve described well, that is only covering about 83% of earnings these days. If we increased that to a higher level, either 90% or all earnings, like Medicare does, that would help us in terms of solvency. There are a bunch of different ways to do this. You could also put a lower tax rate on earnings above the current maximum. And one thing to keep in mind is, do you want to provide additional benefit credit for those earnings above the maximum? There have been a variety of approaches here. Some people say no benefit credit at all. Some people say a smaller amount. I think we saw one proposal that had like a 0.25 factor on those additional earnings at 0.25%, to be clear. So just a tiny, tiny bit of benefit credit. But like I said, a bunch of different ways to do that. Other options are to really increase our current tax base. So instead of taxing just earnings, we could also tax employer group health insurance premiums, or potentially other forms of income. Investment income, like capital gains and losses, interest income, dividend income, or even a wealth tax. So for those folks who are really wealthy, potentially put a tax on that wealth and dedicate that to Social Security. So lots and lots of options, lots of different ways to put them together. And Steve, I think you were going to wrap us up from here.
Absolutely, Karen, thank you. But just stepping back, I can't resist the tax investment income. Everybody is aware that we've heard recently and over times about the possibility of Social Security either investing directly in private securities and not just in treasuries, or even developing one way or the other a very large fund to help finance it. And actually, the way to think about this is that Social Security can directly hold private securities, or taxing investment income is a way of doing basically the same. Having the private securities being held by the general population, but then applying a tax on them. So really, they kind of accomplish the same purpose. These are possibilities for the future. We will see what happens. Now, timing of changes, historically, as everybody's aware, not only in 1983, but also in 1995 and 2015, the Congress has tended to wait until we get close to reserve depletion when it's imminent, and then has acted on it. Given the uncertainties, it's understandable this would be the case. However, the trustees have emphasized for many years now, coming back to our trustees report, that enacting things sooner than the issues are absolutely necessary. It allows more options to be considered. It allows a gradual phase-in and more advance notice. Primary example on this, of course, is back in the 1983 amendments, the increase in the normal retirement age that we're also well familiar with. It didn't start to actually implement until 17 years later. And that is great to keep lots of people out of advance notice, time to adjust, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully we'll have more of that in the future. We also do want to just give a little shout out here for the trustees reports, as Karen indicated, the consistency of the projections over the last years, over the last 13 trustees reports. We've been in, I think, what, a 3-year range for the reserve depletion. So we're happy to say that the projections developed by us and with our trustees have provided a really sound basis for Congress to have expectations of what they are going to need to be doing for the American people, how much and when. And so we're glad to be able to speak to that stability. And our final wrap-up slide here is really the pitch. This is just our little webpage, www.ssa.gov/OACT. Please don't be failing to get there often. Lots of material here, and in addition to all of the material about the trustees report we've talked about, including this presentation, which will be up under presentations, the bottom item here. Also, an actual notice, etc. We also have our estimates for comprehensive proposals, largely by members of Congress directly asking for our estimates, and individual provision estimates, which are almost all subsets, individual provisions from larger proposals that members of Congress have to do scoring on. So all this material is available on the web. Please be there. And we look forward to further discussion. Sam, I think you're going to take it away, and we might even have some Q&As.
Yes. Thanks really a lot, both Karen and Steve, for really comprehensive deep dive into the trustees report of this year. We've had several questions that have been raised. We have about 20 minutes to go, so I hope that we can get some interesting supplementary information as we go over the next 20 minutes. First question, which was asked by both Robert and Julian, was regarding a particular assumption, a demographic assumption, that is immigration. It's obviously been in the news a lot lately, and the question is, how does the immigration assumption affect funding, and any observations you may have regarding the projection?
Let me start a little bit, and then Steve, I'm sure you'll have more to say. So immigration affects our projections in a few ways. Number one, we project people coming into the country lawfully under the typical visa caps. Those folks come into the country, they work, they earn benefits, basically just like any citizen would. We also project people coming into the country as other than lawful permanent residents. So folks who are both unauthorized workers, folks who come in under temporary visas and overstay those visas. Those folks affect the trust funds in a couple of ways. Number one is often they work. And if they're giving Social Security some sort of Social Security number, their earnings end up going into the trust funds. If they do not end up becoming lawfully authorized to stay in the country or work in the country, basically that's just a win for Social Security. We get that money and they don't get their benefits. Now, many of those people do end up transferring to lawful status. So if they do that, they're able to claim those earnings and get benefits based on them. Another important way immigrants affect the country is their children born in this country do end up being citizens. So looking out to the future, they're a worker just like any other. So they contribute to they pay into the system, they will get benefits from the system. So we try to take that comprehensive look at people coming in, both lawfully and other than lawfully.
And if I may add, Karen, I just at a very high level, and I think you'd alluded to this on one of the slides earlier in the presentation, is we have people entering our population by birth, obviously, that's the principle. Historically, we had been in the order of on the order of 4 million births. I think we're lower than that now. But we had a net immigration, number of people entering the country more than leaving the country, on the order of about 1 million. So if you look at our generation of population in the country, 3 to 4 million from births and another 1 million for net immigration, that's an incredibly important factor. And since immigration tends to come in at maybe 25 to 30 or so years of age, it's almost like having had a boost in the total fertility rate back 30 years ago. So that has a very significant impact on the age distribution of the program, which again, remembering this is a pay-as-you-go program. So the number of people at working age versus higher age is really, really critical, and immigration has a very substantial impact on that. In addition to all the skills and abilities that immigrants bring in and help diversify and improve our population.
Thanks for those comments. I'd also make a note that the Academy's Committee on Social Security is preparing an issue brief on this topic about the effects of immigration on Social Security. So look forward to that later on this year. Another question which was raised by Stephen was with regards to the impact of gain from mortality due to COVID-19. There is a small amount of impact, 0.01 effect that was noted on the slides. Any comments about what impact that the pandemic actually had, whether it be through mortality or for other purposes, other factors?
Well, the impact of COVID, maybe I'll start with that one, Karen. Okay, so COVID, of course, we had well in excess of 1 million more deaths occurring largely at higher ages. And that had some effect, obviously, on the number of people at higher ages in receipt of benefit then and into the future. On the other hand, though, one of the other factors that was even a more immediate effect than that really was the effect of the pandemic-induced recession in the year 2020. There was concern that that would be something like the Great Recession. We'd have a significant economic downturn in effect. As it turned out, it was only brief, so we really did not have much effect from that. So bottom line, really what has happened with COVID, we had some excess deaths. Lots of those excess deaths are people probably who would have died relatively soon in any case. So it's not exactly a wash, but at least there's a lot of sort of offset and less impact than we might expect. Another factor that was much of concern is that people would have post-COVID conditions, and that people would be debilitated and have limitations, and we'd have a big increase in people applying for disability. Clearly, from the earlier slides we've seen, we have not seen that. So bottom line, and I think Karen alluded to this earlier, that we have sort of from the very beginning been presuming that some of the positive, dare we say, effects and the negative effects in terms on Social Security solvents would tend to go in opposite direction, might be about balance. And so far that appears to be about right. One of the real questions, I think, is though, will the residual effects of having been exposed to COVID, like most other things, affect people who were exposed, say, in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s, when they get up into their 60s and 70s? Will it diminish life expectancy by way of the insult that they incurred at earlier ages? Obviously, decades to go until we have any sense of that, and we'll never be able to sort that out in any way relative to all the other factors, but it's certainly a point of some concern.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Tammy asked the question of how, if at all, would the proposed Social Security Act, that in particular possible elimination of the windfall elimination provision and the general pension offset, well, how will those, if that occurs, affect actuarial assumptions?
Well, Karen, I don't know if you, no, go ahead.
No, so I know there is a proposal out there to completely eliminate the WEP and the GPO. These are, I don't know how many of you are familiar with these, but basically for those folks who have been working in the public sector and not paying into Social Security, their benefit formula gets changed. So, I mean, to simplify, so that their Social Security benefit is a little bit lower than it would be otherwise. And many of the teachers unions and public employee unions are pushing to get rid of that. We have analyzed that, and completely getting rid of WEP and GPO. Steve, I think we were just looking at this the other day. What was it? It was like a 0.13 change in the actuarial deficit, and then a slight change, probably months, in the reserve depletion year.
Right, and I might just add that actually I happen to have taken a peek here on a hunch, as in my cousin Vinny. We actually have on the provisions indicated up on our webpage, if you look at provision B as in boys 7.14, you will see the proposal that we scored in 2022 for members of Congress Davis and Spanberger, and also for Senator Brown back in 2016. Yes, 0.13% increase in our actual deficit we would see, and it would, by several months, less than about on the order of a half a year, make our reserve depletion date a little bit sooner. But again, this is the people who would be affected by this. It's the roughly 1/4 of state and local government employees who are not covered under Social Security, and of course, a very few people who are still around who had not been covered under Social Security who were federal employees. Not many of them left at this point. But yes, it is those people who are receiving a reduction. Oh, and by the way, you should also look at our webpage, please. We have estimates for lots of other proposals for not eliminating the WEP and GPO, but also for making modifications of it in ways that are thought by many that would be more accurate and more fair in terms of the way that they affect benefit levels.
Another observation, the several Academy committees are working on a paper on non-covered workers. So stay tuned for that paper as well. Probably hopefully sometime in the summer. Another question that I have is fertility. Fertility is a assumption that was changed this year from 2.0 children per woman to 1.9. Other forecasters have dropped that assumption even lower to 1.7 or even 1.5. Any observations of why stop or why make the decrease only to 1.9?
Well, just a quick note on that, as Karen indicated earlier, our trustees have always, we believe, quite wisely made changes incrementally. I believe if you look back to like the 1980s and the mid 1980s, a lot of people were expecting at the time that the birth rate, which had dropped down to about 1.74 at a low point, and I believe it was 1976, people were expecting that that trend would keep going down, it would get lower and lower. That did not happen. Now, of course, there is a matter of the replacement rate for population. Will we move back towards that? That is a big question. But we have seen, as Karen indicated, from what's sometimes referred to as tempo, if women decide to start having children at higher ages, that will temporarily lower birth rates. More than that appears to be going on now. But will the circumstances that are today leading towards less family formation, less marriage, and less births be a persistent thing into the very distant future? One can, of course, do the classic way of looking at whatever has happened most recently and assume that just stays forever. But what we've seen historically is that there has been a tendency for some rebound on this. Very, very good question. If this persists for many more years, I'm sure the trustees will at some point in the not too distant future take some further incremental steps. But Karen, do you have any further reason for hope here?
Well, I do have one other thing to add. I don't know if it's a reason for hope. We just keep in mind that we are doing these projections for 75 years in the future. So we have always found that incremental approach is a really good and wise way to go. And not just assuming that the recent experience will persist over those 75 years without more evidence in that direction.
And I guess another point on that is, of course, fertility. Any change in birth rates in a given year, we're looking at 25 years distant in the future before that has a direct effect on the working age population. So there's really quite a lag here. And to the point you raised earlier, Sam, for some of the people putting in questions, immigration can have a much more immediate effect.
Thanks for those perspectives. Following up in terms of the process that underlies the trustees report development, Dale asks the question of how much input does the trustees really have in the work in the development of the trustees report. In particular, there haven't been any public trustees for several years who presumably would understand the projection process more than the trustees. There hasn't been any public trustees since 2015. What impact, or what's the process that you use or that is used by the trustees and the Office of the Chief Actuary to develop the trustees report?
Well, let me just mention, Sam, this is very much a collaborative experience. All of the trustees have staff that we work with day in, day out, in addition to the trustees themselves. Secretary Yellen at Treasury, I think she has quite a bit of experience in this area. So I think, yes, public trustees can be brought in with particular experience, but between her, Javier Becerra and our other two ex officio trustees currently, including our very own Commissioner Martin O'Malley, they have a lot of knowledge and experience in this and plenty of staff to advise them. So I think we're in pretty good shape, but it is a collaborative experience. We in our office do make recommendations to the trustees on an annual basis for all the demographic, economic, and programmatic assumptions. We discuss them at length with the trustees and especially with their staffs and come to an agreement as to where we should be. But again, the fundamental thing is believing in there being incremental changes. Over the history of the program, we've seen too many times where something seems to be going in a direction and overreaction can do a real disservice. Because remember, the reason for these reports is to advise Congress on what they are going to have to be doing in the distant or not too distant future on making changes. We do not want to be in a position of having the assumptions and the projections moving wildly in one direction or another from one year to the next. Some level of stability, especially as Karen said, for a 75-year projection, there should be a lot of stability there. And again, remember on the birth rates in particular, we've seen this before. We've seen the drop to an all-time low. The all-time low is not at 1.74, it's about 1.62. So it's even a little bit lower at this point. Will it recover? A good question. And of course, there's also, as pointed out earlier, the immigration.
Thanks for that answer and response. Maybe this is a little micro or detailed, but in the Jeffrey asked a question regarding the programmatic assumptions. It seemed to be fairly high. I think he indicated 72% of the total gain came from programmatic assumption changes. Could you elaborate on that? Just and just to let our audience know what are these assumptions?
Right, so I assume what Jeffrey did there, actually, let me see if I can find that slide, is to take this 0.08 we've got at the bottom and divide that by the 0.11 total change. Just keep in mind that the 0.11 overall change is a net of many different effects. So saying that it's 0.72, correct, but there are many different things going in each direction. So things included there, let me see. One thing was actually related to fertility change, and I know this is one of Steve's pet peeves. He always says we should lump that in with the fertility assumption change, but we did make a slight method change to change the path of the fertility rates, just to better reflect what we thought would be reasonable. And because that was a method change, it actually falls into this bucket rather than with the assumption change. Other things that fall in here are just programmatic data coming in. So if we see changes in things like just the number of beneficiaries that we hadn't anticipated, that would fall into here. I think there was a slight method change related to the model we use to come up with the number of insured people. So that would fall into here as well. Bottom line, we're just always looking at the methods for our various models and trying to make sure they're the best that they can be.
And I would just add that if you look historically, and again, the actual note, Karen, I forget what the number of it is, but I think we put that up every single year about the changes since '83. The cumulative changes come from a number of different areas. Looking at just 1 year at a time, the change in one particular area can be a little bit misleading. It's probably useful for everybody to take a look at that actual note. The method changes, I think, amount to, on balance, since 1983, a very small portion of all the changes. It's largely basically from the assumption. Much of it from economic, not much at all from demographic.
Thanks for that. We're just about out of time. So we'd just like to express on behalf of the American Academy of Actuaries the contributions of both of you, Steve, and to Karen and your staff in preparation of this very important report. So we appreciate your presentation to us and to other areas or other panels that you've been putting on for the last week, or hopefully will continue. Again, we appreciate your presentation, and thanks to all those people who raised questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but very much appreciated all of the comments. so far. So thanks to everyone.
And Sam, just a note on the questions. There's some questions we didn't get to. If you share them with Karen and me, I'm sure we could probably try to provide answers. There might be a way to get them back up for people to see them.
We'll try that. Again, thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
And the other 48 members of our staff, of our office, who are amazing and wonderful, and we would not be here and be able to tell you any of this without them.
Agreed, and thanks.